Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 74th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about mental ill health in universities, the impact on both staff and students alike. And of course, this is an issue very close to my heart, having worked in higher education for 16 years. And in an article published in The Guardian in November 2020, and given the state of universities being closed but still functioning, it's really important to be mindful of the impact and the intense stress that both staff and students are under. This article stated that students need more support from their universities than ever before as they grapple with online learning, and the link to that piece is in the show notes. But I would absolutely also say for staff it's been full on, with never-ending teaching, either live, recording lectures, which I know many of my academic friends have been doing till 3 a.m, because recording is actually much harder than giving a live lecture and having to stop and re-record when you haven't had the AV specialist training. Marking, caring, including homeschooling and endless online meetings. So what can be done to prevent the perfect conditions for what we're calling a mental ill health factory? To join me in discussing this in greater detail is Andrew Keenan, CEO of SU Skills, Student Union Skills. Andrew is a freelance strategist and consultant specialising in students' unions. He joined his student newspaper in 2004 and has been involved in student unions ever since. By 2018, he was a member of the senior management team at Imperial College Union, and that's how we met and know each other, looking after a range of student-facing teams and services. He then took the leap into freelancing in 2019, setting up SU Skills, his strategy and training agency for student unions, but also if you're not part of a student union, you can absolutely access those courses. And as well as consulting work, SU Skills helps other freelancers create courses and training packages, increasing their reach and income. And I'm very pleased to say that I have a course called the Mentally Healthy Student Leader on this platform. And Andrew's goal is to help student unions become effective forces for change, with students at the heart of everything they do. So I'm really excited today to welcome Andrew to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, we're really delighted that you're here with us and you're going to share your insights, which is fantastic. So I think it'd be really interesting for the listeners to know about your passion for student engagement, where it came from and how it all happened. I've talked a little bit about what you do, Andrew, but I think it'd be lovely to hear that from you.
I first got involved in student unions right at the very start of my time at university. I joined the student newspaper and I pretty effectively followed the rule of not letting my degree get in the way of my education. And in the 13 or so years, 12 and a half years since I graduated, I haven't used my degree once, but I have worked in student unions continuously ever since. So I'm definitely, what's the word I'm looking for? Institutionalized, but in a good way.
You and me both, Andrew. I didn't let my degree get in the way either. We joke, don't we, Andrew, that once you're a student union officer, you're always a student union officer.
Yes, yeah. And just thinking about your question again about what my passion for student engagement, I think that there's quite a lot of misunderstanding, or maybe just limited understanding of what student unions do, that there is a social thing or an opportunity for people to make friends, and that is there and that's important. But I think their main function is they help people reach their potential and understand who they are and what they want to do in life far quicker than those people would otherwise. So they're kind of like engines for squeezing out people's real ideas of what they want to achieve and their capabilities when they're 18 or 19 rather than 30 or 35.
I totally agree. And I think that if it hadn't been for my engagement in the student union, I wouldn't be here running my own business actually, or maybe it would have been a very different business to the one that it is now because of the experience that I had. And then delving down into that a bit further then, Andrew, how did you then niche down? It might have been intentional, it might have been unintentional, around communication. So what you do now with SU Skills and comms and being a comms expert, how did that happen? How did that come to the fore?
So I actually started over in the kind of policy academic representation part of student unions. So thinking about how students feed into educational quality, how they feed back on the kind of teaching or lectures or learning environments that they have. And it took quite a while for me to get involved in communication. It was about 5 or 6 years later that I really began to engage with the communication team and eventually became head of communications at Imperial College Union. And what really interested me about communications was the realization that it's not just about putting up posters, either literally or metaphorically. It's about finding ways to really explain and clearly distill and narrate what the organization does and what it's trying to achieve and why, in ways that actually mean something to the audiences, that matter to the audiences, is an art. It's not really just about creating posters or social media content or anything else. It's about telling a story in a compelling fashion that changes people's minds, that wins arguments, and ultimately achieves what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when we come to think about student health and well-being, then what role do you think comms, communications has to play in supporting students with their well-being whilst they're at university?
I think there's a really deep role that communications, particularly from students' unions, has to play. If I was to try to summarize that, it's to fight the perception that individual people are doing things wrong, and that's what makes them unwell, physically or mentally. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. And a lot of communications and even campaigns and ideas around student well-being accidentally embed that idea that it's just individual people who are, air quotes here, weak or not prepared. But it's not about the individual, it's about the actual structures that they're entering and the organizations that they're participating in, and how in many ways they are designed, accidentally, but still designed, to create mental health issues or to exacerbate these problems. And the example I use quite a lot, around puppy rooms or handing out fruit to students or something superficial like that. If you have been pushed into a mental health crisis because of a complete lack of understanding of your socioeconomic background, because you can't afford your accommodation, because academics are not responding to your questions, because you can't access learning resources, because your course assumes you can afford to buy lots of extra books, because your future's employer assume that you can do unpaid internships over the summer, and then you say, this is affecting me, and they say, well, would you like to hug a Labrador? It's not going to help.
Yeah, we talk a lot about systems on this show, and one of the, we call the title of this show Mental Ill Health Factory for a reason. And I'm laughing not because it's funny, I'm laughing because in our previous discussions we've talked about this, how yes, we know universities are forces for good, we're both huge fans, but the systems don't support people. So what do you think are the ways in which this mental health, this churning of mental ill health can happen? You've mentioned some of them. You've talked about accommodation, you've talked about departments that may not be supportive, but why are we referring to it as this mental ill health factory?
I call it that partly to get people to sit up and pay attention, and quite often that works. It's one of these phrases that, particularly if you use it in a university context, upsets people in a way that helps you understand how they currently perceive things. So it's kind of like sonar in that sense. You say it and you can see from people's reactions where they are in terms of understanding of the problem. There are lots of people who go to university, far more than any have ever before. And I think that kind of the underlying structures of universities, and I'm not going to go into that in detail, I'm not the person to go into that in detail, are set up to support a very narrow slice of the population. I think for other people, there are assumed support mechanisms, whether it's wealthy parents or free housing or ability to study outside of work without having to earn, which don't exist for other people. And these kind of compound a little bit over time, ultimately to really put intolerable stresses upon people. And then it does that in quite large volumes and quite large batches. So you could call it a factory that every year a sizable university is reliably producing a 2,000 person batch of depressed or mentally unwell or somewhat traumatized people. And then the next year they're going to produce it again.
I also don't think it helps, does it, with the targets that universities have to meet in the sense of financial targets. Now, of course, I know that they have to be financially salient and, the books have to balance. That's not what we're saying. But the way in which this has been done, I think some of the things we saw in September 2020 at the start of the new academic year and how students were locked up, and I don't want to mention any institutions because I know there would, I'm not justifying it, but I know there's a lot to that, and I know there would have been a lot of people desperately trying to make sure that students were safe. But I almost think because they're such big junkets, there are too many competing priorities, and the thing that gets heard is about the money, when actually it's a case for me of, oh, if we need to spend some money, if we're down this year, we need to be inventive and creative, and that doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, I completely agree. And something that I'm regularly challenged on, and which I really want to emphasize, is I don't think there's a single staff member of any university who's actively trying to make students' lives worse. And when I say it's a mental illness factory, in some senses, I'm not just talking about students. I can be talking about postdocs, about lecturers, about support staff, professional staff, many of whom are on increasingly precarious contracts, who've had their pensions threatened, who have been tipped by lockdown and other factors into working conditions that sometimes just are not manageable. And we're all trapped in the same system, as it were. So I don't want to set up a false dichotomy of the staff are doing this to the students. That's just not what I believe. When it comes to the institutions, I think you're right that it's something to do with the size of the institution and what kind of metrics actually matter and are actually measured. And the way I would put it is that if an organization has a value of well-being, student well-being, staff well-being, being a supportive environment, if that value doesn't hurt, then it's not your value. It's just a nice word you put on the wall. It has to constrain your decision-making. And if you're going to choose to close a cheap hall of residence to build a profitable one, or if you're going to expand your student numbers but not expand your counselling service size and so on, you do not have a value of well-being because you're not making decisions which reflect that. So yeah, I think that quite often the money side is given primacy, and then people say, well, to live up to our values, we should do X, Y, Z financially, but those arguments don't win.
No, that's a really helpful way to frame that, because you're absolutely right. And this is why we see in all organizations so much plaster sticking. Oh, it's Gender Awareness, Sexual Violence Week. Oh my goodness, now we're over here with Black Lives Matter. Oh, we're over here with accessibility and disability support. Well, you're absolutely right. Whereas if you set a standard and everyone says, right, we're really committed to this, it's less likely that we see the fractures that we have seen over the last few months.
Yeah. So if the value isn't making something harder, or making a decision more complicated, or ruling out stuff that you would love to do but are now outside your value system, if it's not doing any of those things, then it's not a value. It's just a PR stunt.
Yeah, and that's across the board. We see it in all sorts of organizations, that sort of thing that happens. So if I gave you a magic wand then, Andrew, what do you think universities should be doing to create genuinely mentally healthy systems that benefit staff and students alike?
There's a few different things that come to mind. Depending on this podcast, 4 hours long, 8 hours long, I should see. Okay. First things that come to mind, if I could wave a magic wand, the first group I'd point at is actually the students themselves. And I think quite often returning students, second, third, fourth and above, because they've had a very stressful first year, they pass that on to the cohort below them. And it's almost like oh, well, we had to go through it, so you will as well. And sometimes the way that presents is a complete confusion of two different things, which is a subject is complex, theoretical physics is really complex, and something is horrible to learn. And those are not the same thing. And I've met so many academics and so many students who basically wear as a badge of pride how difficult it is to learn their material. But it's not the complexity of the material, it's the way they present it. So I would try and uproot that what's the word for it? Uproot that delusion that because your curriculum is perceived as difficult or abstruse or complex that it's somehow academically rigorous, because that's not the same thing. And I would stop students kind of passing on the whole, 1 in 10 of you are going to fail, 1 in 4 of you are going to drop out, a first from here is worth more than the first from anywhere else, or work hard, play hard, and all these kind of nonsense cliches, which are basically sticking plasters over the idea that we assign far too much coursework, or we put far too much emphasis on timed exams, or we limit access to resources so that people have to compete, or that we grade on a certain curve so that only a certain percentage of students can get a good mark. And then we set up an artificial kind of within the student body competition against each other. There's all these factors. I would point the magic wand at those if I could.
Great. And anything you wanted to mention about staff?
For staff, I would take a look at things like the TEF and the REF and the other kind of ranking systems, which I think have some pretty perverse incentives, which force people to produce papers and produce publications, and that may not be their thing. Anything which forces academics who may have a genuine preference for just doing research, that forces them to do teaching against their will, because that's not going to work out better for anyone. Yeah, that's what I think of for that.
So just for those of you who don't know, Teaching Excellence Framework is the TEF, and it was introduced not that long ago, a few years ago, to look at teaching excellence, and the REF is the Research Excellence Framework. So what you will normally find is universities, so the older, more established Russell Group universities, tend to score very highly in Research Excellence Framework because they're more research focused. And the TEF, in some ways, I know that newer universities have argued it's a really helpful measure for them because they can be more teaching focused and it can be more vocational qualifications. And me just saying that actually again makes me think about this system that we have in the UK. All universities are meant to kind of be equal, and yet there's such a difference. And I don't think people really understand the differences in the grading system, how it's approached, the paper-based exercises. So yes, I don't think that adds to people's mental health and well-being, staff, students, or employers, in fact, in deciphering what this all means.
It's a very, very complicated landscape. And I'm not saying that I would take the TEF, the REF, or even the NSS, which is the National Student Survey. I'm not saying that I would take all those and tear them up.
No.
But I do think that the way they've been introduced has added far more stress than it has added any kind of shedding any kind of light on the quality or relative quality of universities.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to students' unions then, and how they support students during their time at university, and potentially beyond as well, tell us a little bit about SU Skills, how you work with student unions and the courses and things you have available on the site.
Yeah, so SU Skills, that's my strategy and training agency for students' unions. I started when I went freelance in 2019. And I thought I was being quite clever and original, and there wasn't many freelancers in the students' union sector. I quickly realized I was one of at least 30, if not many more. And I decided I would try and see that as a positive thing, as a sign of demand, rather than jumping into a crowded pond. SU Skills is my idea for helping more consultants and freelancers reach more unions in the limited amount of time that we all have. At the moment, a lot of the training and support that consultants and freelancers offer, pre-pandemic anyway, was the model of get on a train, sit in a room and do a half day or a day of training. Obviously, there's a hard upper limit there that everyone has the same number of days in the week and weeks in the year as everyone else. And it's quite not necessarily fully accessible for people, particularly external trustees or students who are still studying full time, who may not be able to access these sessions. So if that training or course was made available online so that people could access it whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted, and that content creators, the consultants, could have people taking their courses and learning from them while they're asleep or on holiday or working with someone else as a source of passive income. I thought that more unions could access a lot more expertise, and it also could potentially push the price point down quite considerably. That was some very unintentional alliteration there.
And so the course is on SU Skills. So if the links will be in the show notes. Please do check them out if you're listening and you're from a student union background or you work in a student union. I am biased because I've got a course on there, and I really enjoyed making it with you and working with you. So someone who knows much more than me about comms and beautifying online courses, a real mix of interesting things. So how did they all come to be about on the site? And just some feedback that you've had maybe, and how people have been, how receptive people have been to the programs.
So it has been a real pleasure working with you on the Mentally Healthy Students' Union Leader course. Links available in the show notes. When I first realized I was one of many, many consultants, I thought, right, I should actually socialize with these people, work with these people, learn some more about them. Many of them were names that I kind of heard through Students' Union networks in the past. And we all had the same observation that our work was limited by how much time we could spend in a room with a certain group of officers or staff. So when I've mentioned the idea, I've had a lot of really positive feedback from people who are interested in creating courses. One of the challenges that I've had to overcome is helping people begin that process, because it can be quite daunting for people to go from doing their usual in-person presentation to thinking, how do I shoot a video? How do I record audio? How do I create an online presentation? So I'm looking to help people through that. It's also been received well by students' unions who would like to be able to access training on demand without also having to pay for travel and costs and arranging time, for example, for their boards to attend training in their entirety. And also the idea that an individual staff member in a students' union could over time build up a records of the courses that they've accessed and have taken on SU Skills, which could travel with them between unions. So, for example, someone could take the Mentally Healthy SU Leader course, and then a course on social media marketing for students' unions, and then one on how to handle external speakers, or one on charity law for students' unions. And this is knowledge and expertise that then they can then access again and again while working in that union, and can also take with them as part of their career development in future. So it's been a really positive response so far. And it's kind of a pipeline of courses coming down the slipstream to launch, to mix my metaphors there. And I'm really excited about the range of those. So everything from digital marketing to inclusive recruitment to mentally healthy leadership to how to buy social media content.
And the thing, what I really like about what you said is the sustainability and the longevity and the embedding the learning, which I know is a cliched phrase, but it's true, because often, as you said, the upper limit of trainers like us or like me going in, and that's what I used to do. I used to spend half my life on trains, and it's been very strange not having been on a train since the 17th of March. But how people can learn, and how online courses can be a much better tool and a much better refresher, and hopefully that people will take those skills, because the idea is that they take those skills and really use them in their day-to-day role and build on them. And it also helps them to it helps them to progress in their career as well.
That's exactly the idea. And I think it also fits with how younger people in particular expect to learn things. These days, if anyone wants to do anything, they're on YouTube within a few seconds, and someone has made a video tutorial on how to do it. Anything from Photoshop to hanging a picture to fixing a washing machine. And that kind of sea change in how people access training hasn't really reached the students' union sector, in my opinion, in my limited experience. And I'd like to be the person that brings that there and offers this platform for so many different experts to really, as you said earlier, niche down into what their specialist subject is and produce really good content, which is really widely accessible. And one of the groups that's most interested in the material on SU Skills is what you would call the small and specialist institutions, or their students' unions. So small agricultural colleges or music colleges who just don't have the finances to hire a consultant, and they don't have the staff resources to hire in an expert on a full-time or a part-time basis, but they would just absolutely jump at the opportunity to access this training affordably online. So I think it's really going to help there.
Yeah, fantastic. And if anyone's listening and they're thinking, oh, I'm not from a student union background, but these courses sound really great, can they take them? Can they access them? Any plans for the future around this?
Yeah, they can. So anyone can go to suskills.co.uk and see what courses are there. And you can get in touch with me or register your interest, and I'll be in touch with you. And actually, one of the courses that's had the most unions sign up so far, which is a trustee foundations course, so the very, very essential basics of how to be a charity trustee, already has quite a bit of interest from charities that are not students' unions, because the person that created it works with SUs and with other charities. So that course is going to be recreated with less of a focus on students' unions and made accessible to small and micro charities of any sector. And hopefully that will be the first of many.
I hope so too, because I think as brilliant as they are for an SU student union audience, they are fantastic courses. I've been able to have a look at some of the back end of these, so I encourage you to absolutely have a look. And then Andrew, just a question that I ask all my guests is, you run your own business, you are very busy, you have lots going on in your life. So how do you look after your own mental health, and what are your top 3 tips for the way you do this?
Oh, that's a really good question. Pre-pandemic, I think my number 1 tip would be get yourself an office, or at least a co-working space that isn't in your flat. Because for me, I really needed that physical and time separation between home and work. So whether it was, even if it's a 5-minute walk or a 45-minute tube journey or something like that, the start or end of each day, it's kind of the on-off switch for work mode and home mode. And what I found pre-pandemic and at the start of the pandemic is work life and non-work life just blended together into one shapeless blob of picking up my laptop at 11 at night because I had nothing else to do, or finding myself not sitting down to work at noon or something like that. So that was my first bit of advice. And, it's lockdown, so people can't necessarily do that. But I think having, if you can, a physical space within your flat that then gets packed up and put away on the weekends and some of the evenings will help you keep that separation. Other things, particularly for self-employed and your own businesses, I try to take a very relaxed attitude about how much work I do between 9 to 5, or at least how many chunks of not at all working time I take between 9 and 5. So if I find myself taking a break or watching Netflix or eating another caramel shortcake, I'm not going to be upset with myself about it. This is why I went self-employed. So I have this kind of flexibility. And a third one, try and get a bit of daylight, actual daylight, not just through windows.
Yeah, brilliant tips. And I love the way you make a reference to caramel shortcake specifically, which for me feels very cultural, Andrew.
Well, I am a stereotype for that reason.
I don't mean that. She reminds me of I had she's not obviously my biological grandma, but a neighbour, and she was from Stirling, and that reminds me of her because every time I went to see her, she would always present these amazing biscuits and sweet things that I'd never have at home. So you saying that reminds me of that, which is why I said I love the fact that it's so specific. Okay, and finally, so if people want to know more about your work, how would you like them to contact you? Links, how can they follow you? And of course, these will be included in the show notes, but it'd be lovely to hear from you as well.
So the website is suskills.co.uk. So that's the SU that stands for Students' Unions. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Both of those are at SU Skills. I think I signed up for a TikTok account, but it has no content. And even if it did, I'd be embarrassed about mentioning it. So one day I'll release that. And you can contact me by email on hello@suskills.co.uk.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for your time. We've had a really good conversation about mental health, mental ill health, universities, how they help, how they hinder, how systems can change to support people's mental health. And of course, SU Skills, the platform that enables people to learn more and enact these skills in their day-to-day role. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And take care, and make sure everyone that you can have your caramel shortcakes and get outside in the teeny bit of sunshine that we have at the moment. So thank you so much and take care. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.